I want to turn your attention this morning again to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, and we're just reading one verse there, and then we'll turn over to the next book, the book of Leviticus. Exodus 20 and verse number 7, and then Leviticus 19. The third commandment, and you have probably at least heard something along this line before, but hopefully today there'll be something a little bit extra, maybe a little further than what we just normally think of. Exodus chapter 20, verse number 7 says, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." And then over to Leviticus chapter 19 and verse number 12. "And ye shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Now, the swearing that's just referred to right there is most likely referring particularly to the idea of oaths or we sometimes use that even in swearing, as we call it swearing, but more in the area of making vows or, I swear to tell the truth and that kind of thing. And so there are a couple different ways that we think about that in this area of taking God's name in vain or swearing in that way. Cursing is another way we think of it. And so there's several different aspects here, but we've of course been dealing with this issue of God's expectations, but in this area I'd like to deal with it particularly as God's expectations of honor. How do we honor Him? How do we honor His name? And do we take it lightly? I've read the little bit of just about Harry Truman when he was the president, and he would have a staff meeting each morning at 8:30. And one particular morning, the mail clerk brought in just a fancy letter, I guess you would say, some sort of correspondence. It turned out to be from the Saudi Arabia king, and I read his name somewhere, but I'm not sure what that was now. But anyway, it was a lavender envelope with the regal wax seal there and had flowing purple ribbons and just, all fancied up, Well, the letter was addressed, or the salutation of the letter actually began like this. It said, "Your Magnificence." And Harry Truman just kind of laughed, and he told his staff there that it would be all right if they just start calling him that too. "Your Magnificence." The problem was that before very long, Harry Truman also supported I guess you would just say it that way, sort of supported the admission of 100,000 Jews into Palestine. And then the Saudi Arabian king wasn't quite as thrilled with Truman. And so after a while, Truman got another letter from the same man. This time, instead of saying, Your Magnificence, it just simply said, "Dear Mr. President." And the luster had kind of gone off the rose, I guess you'd say, or whatever. And it was a little different story. But we're living in a day when proper respect for authority largely seems like it's just sort of gone by the wayside. And it's not that we shouldn't respect things, but authority has been just sort of scoffed at maybe in some ways. And that respect, even things like sir and ma'am, have kind of gone by the wayside. It's a thing of the past. It almost seems like in these days it's a little more cool to be cocky or arrogant or careless or aggressive. And so maybe we need to think about this a little bit. Such attitudes toward God, cockiness or carelessness or even aggressive as though we deserve something or demand something from God, is certainly not reconciled with Christian conduct. We must not be that way, but we instead owe Him honor. Honor His name. Honor His person. Honor His work among us. And our passage here today, of course, seems to deal especially with with using God's name. We usually think of it in the area of cursing or slang or things like that. But maybe there's some further aspects in this area of honor that we need to take to heart and think about, how much do I really take His name in vain? True Christians need to exercise restraint and reverence and honor to the God that we serve and the one who deserves all of our best. A couple different aspects to that. First of all is our speech, and then also in our conduct. And so we're going to deal with both of those here today. So let's look at this third commandment for a little bit here this morning. First of all, we look at verse 7. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And then we read the passage there in Leviticus, and it's saying, don't be swearing by God's name falsely. Don't you say that you are going to, I'm telling the truth if it's not the truth. Don't use God's name that way. And of course, then we'll touch on this a little bit later on. There's some further aspect even where Jesus said, really just make your yes, yes, and your no, no, and don't worry about all this swearing or making vows or promising necessarily. We usually would allow a promise maybe, but really it should just be yes or no, and that should be good enough. And so anyway, let's look at the aspect of our lips first of all. We must avoid careless lips. Let's go back. I know we just not too long ago, we looked at in the book of James, really spent an extensive time there. But let's go back there for just a moment here this morning. James chapter 3 is the one that especially deals with our tongue and calls it a fire. It's a little matter, or a little member, I should say, but how great a matter a little fire kindleth. Again, there's several verses there that refer to our tongue. But let's especially read verses 8 through 10. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. You shouldn't be doing that, is what he's saying. You shouldn't speak blessing and speak cursing from the same mouth. That's not to say that any of us mean to offend this command. I doubt that any of us really are trying to say things that would be displeasing to God, but we are too careless in many cases. Now, I have read about the old scribes, ancient scribes, that would have been writing out the scriptures. That was their method back then, before the printing press. And so they would write it, but they would write, as they were, writing down through the passage, on a particular page, they would get to the name of God. And so they actually would put down the normal pen or quill or whatever they were using there. They would put that down and they would take up what was called the God pen. And they would write the name of God very carefully, trying to make sure it was just perfect. And then they would transfer back to their normal writing utensil. We call it a pen, but that normal writing utensil, and they would write the rest of it. But if they messed up the name of God, just even a little bit apparently, they would actually throw the whole page away rather than actually have the potential to have displeased God by dishonoring His name. They were so careful with that. They didn't want anything to be imperfect about His name. I'm afraid we've come a far cry from those days, from that mindset. And yet we still serve the very same God, the God who is holy and just and righteous and all of those things that we think of, the wonderful characteristics of God, the qualities of God, but we've sort of lost the respect or the reverence for those things. And so we've gotten into the area of careless lips or careless speech. There's several aspects to that I think we could maybe focus on for a little bit this morning. And the first thing probably that would be helpful, you probably didn't bring a dictionary with you this morning unless you have one maybe electronically or something. Those of you that may listen listen to this message online, maybe you would be able to find one. But let me just touch on what I've called oaths of exclamation. Oaths of exclamation. Now, the first word that we would look up in the dictionary would be the word euphemism. Euphemism. E-U-P-H-E-M-I-S-M. I hope I spelled that right. E-U-P-H-E-M-I-S-M. I think I said that right. The word means or refers to a lesser or less offensive form of a certain word. Okay, so if you use a euphemism, I don't really want to say this word, but I'm going to say this word that's not, it's a little more accepted. It's not quite so bad, and people might not take such offense to it. And so you use a little different word. It may depend on the dictionary that you use if you look that word up, but I have done this, and you can find that the euphemism is, I think the one dictionary I just looked at said a less offensive synonym or something like that. So it means the same thing, it's just not quite as coarse or harsh. Now, if you go and look at some other words that are just commonly used that really, we should be careful about, we should avoid. I could mention a few, and I'm going to go ahead. These are not words that I use, but I'm going to use them because we're dealing with this subject. I'm going to just mention them. And if you look up words like gosh, or golly, or gee, or actually I've looked some others like the some old stuff, bejesus or bejabbers, things like that. Even the word doggone. If you'll look that up, it's a less offensive form of God damn. That is not things that we usually think about. That's, they're less offensive. We don't mind, well, again, I don't use those words, but even the word goodness, I've tried to be careful. If you look at least in some of the dictionaries, you'll probably find that even goodness is pointing back to God and is a milder form of using His name. Things like, oh my goodness, or something like that. Now, I'm not trying to put you under bondage necessarily, except that I want us to recognize that when we are just careless with our speech, sometimes we may be using words that, at least in the old times anyway, we recognize, or even the dictionary would recognize, these are words that are maybe a less offensive form. Obviously, we shouldn't just use the term Jesus or God just carelessly. And yet there are some of these other words that are euphemisms, less offensive synonyms, that seem to fill our speech, or too many people's speech at least, and even those who may try to serve God, they may just simply not realize. And I'm not trying to say, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm not trying to say that we're trying to do that we mean to take God's name, but we need to be careful about those oaths of exclamation. Let's go back for a moment to Matthew chapter 12. And actually, maybe just keep your finger there in Matthew, because we've got several verses there. But Matthew chapter 12 and verse number 36. This is another caution in this area of exclamations. Maybe not even in oaths necessarily, but sometimes our speech can be filled with things that are not necessary. Jesus himself saying these words, he said, "But I say unto you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment." Every idle word. And so we need to be careful about the things that we say. Oaths of exclamation. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Not only that, but we also may refer to oaths of exhortation. Oaths of exhortation. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes it's easy to use God's name, and I've heard this. It's a little bit, it just rubs me the wrong way, I guess. But even in songs or sermons, and we just sort of, it just gets thrown in. My Lord, or my God in heaven or whatever. And sometimes it's not that we're speaking to him. It's become just an oath almost. It's just, well, I'm just saying this hard and I'm preaching, so it makes it okay, but that's not right. Even in our songs, you just kind of throw in, my Lord. If it's not used in the proper way or with proper respect and honor, isn't that in vain? Isn't that in a way that would be displeasing to God? To just have it thrown in? Maybe some of you have experienced this before, even going to a salesman, or you stop in a business somewhere and a salesman comes and deals with you and he finds out your name and he just uses it over and over and over again. It sort of gets a little bit frustrating. You don't even know who I am. Just stop fooling with my name just because you're trying to make me feel better. At least that's the way I look at it, I guess. Maybe you don't see it that way, but it just, we used to have the little phrase, that's my name, don't wear it out. And sometimes we almost maybe have gotten into those situations by somebody who thought they were endearing themselves to us by calling us by our name over and over. Prayer time can be the same type of thing. You go back to the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal were just all around there repeating the same types of things. And sometimes we almost pray that way. And it becomes a filler word in our prayer. It's almost like our prayer becomes a presentation instead of a conversation. We want everybody to think we pray well, and so we can throw in Lord or dear God or whatever, and it's just on and on and on to where it just becomes a filler word. And God's name should never be a filler. Oaths of exhortation. The third one I'd mention to you is another aspect that we usually might think of with an oath, and that is more of a covenant or a promise, and that kind of thing. So let's be careful also about oaths of what I've called earnestness. Oaths of earnestness. Let's go back now to Matthew, and this time chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And a couple different verses, basically in the same passage or same context. But notice that it says in verse 34, Jesus himself, this is the Sermon on the Mount, as we call it. But he says in verse 34, but I say unto you, swear not at all. Now, he's not talking about using profanity. He's saying, don't be making promises calling on God to be your witness. Or, well, he says here, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool. And it goes on through that a little bit. And then verse 37, he says, but let your communication be yea, yea, or we'd say yes, nay, nay, or no. So let your communication be yes and no. For whatsoever is born, is more than these, cometh of evil. So if we have to somehow call God to be our witness, and well, I'm telling you, cross my heart, hope to die, is the way the kids used to say it. But we're calling on God to be our defender or whatever, and say, well, He knows that I'm telling you the truth. And we got to be careful, first of all, about even making vows like that, swearing, as it would be, and even in the courtroom today, there are numbers of people that may say, I don't use the word swear. I don't swear to tell the truth. I'll tell the truth. I affirm that I will. And I don't know if there's a whole lot of difference between it. It should just be yes and no. But it seems like, we try to avoid at least that word because that's used in Scripture. Jesus said, swear not at all. The idea there is you should not have to call on God to defend you. You should just say the truth and people know that you are honest. And so we have to be careful also about oaths of earnestness and not just use God's name in a vain sort of way, especially in the sense that we say, well, God being my witness, I'll do this, and then we don't. So obviously that would be in a vain way as well. So we must avoid careless lips, whether it's in oaths of exclamation or oaths of exhortation, as I've said, with prayer and preaching and songs and things, or oaths of earnestness, which would be our vows. That's what we often think of when we read this verse. We think the commandment says, don't be swearing, don't curse and use God's name in vain that way. However, I would like to go a little further, and I made reference to this earlier, but I want to touch on it again even now, and that is that we must also be careful, or we must avoid, we'll maybe say it that way, we must avoid careless living. We must avoid careless living. Yes, the lips are important, but careless living is even more so. Of course, they're both, lips would be part of our living, I suppose, as well. But let's touch on this for a little bit. And I think this is really where the commandment kind of reaches further than it may appear at first. And we need to really deal with this a little bit. Now, back to Matthew again, this time chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. Verses 21 through 23. I was just thinking of this in the last few days, particularly because it just seemed like we've been hearing about one after another that has passed away, numbers of them with COVID, but some from other issues or whatever. I'm thinking of one in particular that we knew of. My dad pastored this lady for a while. But and in one particular case, not that lady, but another case in particular, but I was thinking about this. Notice that it says in verse 21, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord," there you go. Now that's small letters after the capital, so more like Master, Master than it is what we would say Lord's name in heaven. But still, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven." Now, I want you to look at this, think about this as I read this. If you have it open, you can see it for yourself. But notice the references to his name. "Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord," there they use that again, "have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils? And in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." Now, he's referring to those who stand before God in that final day, in judgment day, so to speak, and they say, "Well, Lord, Lord," again, calling him out, "You're my master." But he says, "Even though you thought you were doing all these things in my name, it was in vain because you didn't live the way you were supposed to live. You didn't do what you were supposed to do." And so Jesus is dealing with this issue of I guess we would just say it, and I think there maybe was a song or something along this line, but not everybody that's talking about heaven is going to go there. There's lots of people talking about it. Lots of people that even claim the name of Christ. "Oh, I'm a Christian." But they don't live for him. And so isn't that taking his name in vain? I have said I'm a Christian, but I don't live like one. I don't live like Christ. If that's the case, we are taking his name in vain. Who gets into heaven? Those who do the will of God. What God asks them to do. What God puts his finger on in their lives. Those are the ones who get to heaven. It's disturbing when we hear about so many people that, they passed away. But then you look at their life, or several of them maybe, and you say, "Well, I don't know. I hope they made it. I hope that somehow they got through to heaven, but they don't live like they used to. They used to really serve God. They used to really be careful in their living. They weren't the last little while. Didn't seem to be when they died." And it's disturbing. It's troubling when you start thinking about that. They've changed their idea on what it takes to get to heaven. And yet they still want to just have full confidence, "I'm going." But have they taken his name, Christian, little Christ, one who follows after Christ, have they taken that name in vain? Because it didn't change their lives? They don't match up to what God commands. About a year ago, our family was privileged to, there was a lot of work, but it was a wonderful day as we gathered just down the road here at a little larger church and had it decorated, and my daughter and son-in-law tied the knot, And as I stood up there, and they're there, and happy and rejoicing. And finally, we got to the end of the ceremony. They have exchanged their wedding vows, promises to one another that we will be true and faithful. And then they turn around, and it's my job to tell the congregation gathered there, I now pronounce to you, their husband and wife, present to you, however, I'm not even sure how I said it now, but present to you Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Williman. And when my daughter went through that ceremony and made those promises before God that I will stay with this man, I will love him, then she didn't leave the church with the same name. She had taken his name. And so now she is Rochelle Williman. Now that's fairly simple. We understand that. Numbers of you have taken on another name. But if she left that special day, the wedding now transitions into a marriage. If she didn't still do what she could to please him, if she didn't care about him, if she didn't show her love for him, if her heart was kind of wandering away, then she sort of, could we say, she took his name in vain. It didn't make any difference. Now, of course, that's not the case for them, and they're happily married. But isn't that a little bit the way it sometimes takes place in spiritual things? And maybe even people in a very similar way. We are supposed to be the bride of Christ, and they come to the altar and they say, I'll be yours, Lord. I'll do what you want me to do. But then they leave the altar. Could I say it, even the marriage altar? And they go out to just live the same old way. And it's as though they've taken his name in vain. Two aspects I want to just deal with quickly, and that is, first of all, that we are accountable to Christ. He is our bridegroom. We are his bride. And he knows whether we've been faithful or not. He knows whether we're living up to his name. Just because we say we're a Christian doesn't make us one. He has to be pleased with us. He has to welcome us as his bride. We have to be living in such a way that we do please him and not take his name in vain. We are accountable to him. He is the one who determines whether we have been a suitable bride. We're accountable to him. But we are also ambassadors for him. And so when we begin we take on the name of Christ, we say, oh yes, I'm a Christian, but there are people all around us that look at our lives. Now, I understand there are probably lots of people who sort of, they just get a little bit touchy about this. They don't want people be, watching their lives or being critical of them. And I understand we don't want people to be critical, but there are people around us. They may not profess any religion whatsoever, but they watch us. And we are ambassadors for Christ. They want to see whether or not we really are who we say we are. And if we've taken Christ's name, we are a Christian, then they expect some things out of us. And we are an ambassador for him. And so we must be careful to avoid just being careless in our living, taking on the name, but not taking on the life. And so this morning, I'm afraid that, I don't want to be too hard on us, but I'm afraid pretty many people, maybe even us, we may be a little bit too careless, maybe even a lot too careless, about the name of God, whether that's in our speech, whether that's in our lifestyle. But maybe God expects a little more out of us than what we sometimes think. His name is important to him. He doesn't want us to just take it carelessly. He deserves, in many cases, he deserves so much more respect and reverence than what we give him. And obviously, we expect, that may not be real common these days, but we expect a young person ought to give honor to their parent. And how much more we ought to honor our Father in heaven, and yet we don't even give the sort of reverence that we would give our own parents. And God help us. Let me just pause for a moment. Again, sometimes we might even have a little caution thrown our way. You know, parent may say, now, wait a minute here, son. Wait a minute, daughter. You are, in my case, you are a Walter, and you need to make sure you live so that that name is not diminished, or that you don't bring dishonor to that name. And so we need to be careful, even as we take on the name of God, that we also give it the proper honor and respect and reverence that it needs. How are you treating his name this morning? How about with your lips, what you're saying, how you're talking? But also, maybe even more critically today, what about the way you're living? Have you taken his name in vain? You say you're a Christian, but do you live like Christ? Can people see Jesus in you?